Yo, I'm Matt, and you're watching FringeCraft. Today we're going to be watching a video revealed. New 9/11 docs show us plot to cover up Saudi connection. And we're going to be looking at some associated content. If you like this kind of content, like this video, subscribe, hit the notification bell. There's plenty of it. So we're watching this video in relation to the 20th anniversary of 9/11, which happened on Saturday, this past Saturday. And it's very relevant this year because we just pulled out of Afghanistan after 20 years. And so whatever we seeked to accomplish in Afghanistan, we seemingly didn't as a country, the United States, because, well, the Taliban have taken back control. That being said, it seems that there were some ulterior motives from different actors relating to 9/11 and what went on. So this video that we're going to be watching by Breaking Points with Crystal and Sagar is directly related to the Saudi connection and talks about documents which were recently declassified relating to the Saudi connection to 9/11. So let's get into the video. Hopefully that has... Okay, yes. Let's pull this up and let's start the video.
Really revelatory documents being released here by the Biden administration with regards to 9/11 in Saudi.
I've become quite obsessed over the last couple of weeks, just kind of revisiting 9/11 over the last 20 years. And one of the parts that will always get me is the Saudi connection and a lot of the questions around the Saudi Arabian involvement. I'll say at the top, like, look, there is still to this date no evidence at the highest levels, and I say the highest levels of the Saudi government were involved in this plot. If anything, they hated bin Laden just as much as we did. But here's the question. What about the lower level ones? And those documents were held very tightly by the Bush administration. The Obama administration vetoed that bill that was pushed through the U.S. Senate, which would allow 9/11 families in order to sue the Saudi Arabian government. Then the Trump administration refused to declassify a further number of documents. Biden, in accordance with the 20th anniversary, ordered them declassified. We covered this about 2 weeks ago. Well, we got our very first one. So let's put this up there on the screen. And this is very important, because what it does is that the first declassified 9/11 document by the FBI also includes a memo. Now, within the memo, the FBI actually point to it and say definitively that it now shows no Saudi conspiracy. So,
Okay, on that statement, definitively no Saudi conspiracy. Let's first look back at the video that I covered on Saturday, 9/11 a conspiracy theory. I watched this over again. It's the 20th anniversary of 9/11, but it's the 10th anniversary of this video. And one of the topics is the 19 hijackers. And the next topic that I have here is Saudi involvement in 9/11. This video, I believe, is the when he said they covered it, Breaking Points covered it, a couple weeks ago. I think this might have been the video. So you can go and click this link and, see exactly. I have all the resources here or as many as I could put with a 5,000 character limit. Additionally, you can go to the Corbett Report website and click the 9/11 a conspiracy theory link, and there's a transcript. You can click all the links he has. He has much of the information. So let's get back to Saudi involvement in 9/11. There were 19 hijackers, and 15 of them were Saudi nationals. That seems like a Saudi conspiracy, whether it's connected to the government or not. And Osama bin Laden himself was a Saudi national. Other than he might have already at that point had his citizenship revoked. He is from Saudi Arabia. His family is wealthy and, influential in Saudi Arabia. So there is definitely a Saudi Arabian connection. Whether it's at the highest levels, being the monarchy itself and the people directly, under the king and crown prince, that's what this is looking at. But there is clearly a Saudi connection, and I would say there's clearly a Saudi conspiracy if 15 of the hijackers and Osama bin Laden were Saudi nationals. I mean, actually. So let's continue this, but just keep that in mind as we watch this video.
So let's put that Zero Hedge actually is the one who spotted this. Let's put that up there on the screen, that tweet. And what he points to there is that the FBI's kind of introductory memo, which was written in 2016, says it puts to bed any doubts about Saudi complicity. However, that is not even remotely true. Because what you can actually see within the document is that it details even further the Saudi official Omar al-Bayoumi, who was in California and actually helped two of the 9/11 hijackers both secure a boarding house, a place to stay. He claims that he just ran into them while he was at, right? Also, Mr. Bayoumi, get this, was a grad student who never went to school, had no discernible source of funds, and just happened to be in California next to the 9/11 hijackers.
That seems legit.
I got a lot of questions.
They've also tracked the way he was in fact receiving all of these payments from all these like Saudi-run firms and not showing up to actually do any work, but still getting paid. And these two hijackers, they didn't speak any English.
No, exactly. It was Midhar and Hazmi. They spoke zero English, and he was their shepherd. And they were the first two to arrive here in the United States.
Right. And what people who encountered them at the time said is that there was no way they could have navigated around America without help. Bayoumi just happens to meet them immediately upon their arrival, happens to provide financial support to them as well, and basically shepherd them around. And then why this is important is because he had direct connections to at least Saudi consular officials and was being paid backdoor by the Saudi government. So effectively, it looks very much like Mr. Bayoumi was Saudi intelligence, operational on the ground here, doing something, and just happened to become really besties with these two 9/11 hijackers.
The new memo also cites an FBI source who said Bayoumi held, quote, very high status at the Saudi consulate in LA. So at the time, they tried to portray him as, he was barely anybody, didn't even know here. Here's what they said. He had, quote, even higher than many of the Saudi persons in charge of the diplomatic mission, strongly suggesting that he was an intelligence agent running a covert op on U.S. soil. So that is what is inside the new 9/11 document. And I knew when it was going to come out that it was almost certainly going to concern al-Bayoumi. Really what it is that there are so many questions on 9/11 which remain completely unanswered. Lawrence Wright, who wrote The Looming Tower, which is my favorite book on 9/11, he gave an interview that I was watching this weekend in which, the exact reason why the CIA never put Nawaz al-Hazmi and Khalid al-Midhar on a FBI watch list still today is unclear.
Wow.
And by that, I mean they covered it up.
Wow.
They still, 20 years later, we do not have an official justification as to why a CIA cable, which recognized that these two gentlemen had visas to the United States in 2000, were not given over to the FBI. We don't have the names of those people. We don't know who was responsible. Over 50 people read that CIA cable while it was inside of their system. Nobody at the FBI was notified. Now look, is there a question, could the FBI have even tracked him down? Would have been hard. Look, it was 2000. Like, it wasn't exactly the same situation. But maybe, what if we tried? There are so many of these bureaucratic messes. And to this day, not one person inside the CIA was ever fired because of 9/11.
Well, and it's just clear that for decades, the connections to Saudi officials have been covered up. And that's
100%.
the 9/11 Families United, Terry Estrada, they put out a statement with a very different assessment of this document than the government's official assessment of like, who can say whether there were Saudi connections here? Let's go ahead and throw that statement up on the screen, or at least a portion of it. They say, now the Saudi secrets are exposed and it is well past time for the kingdom to own up to its officials' roles in murdering thousands on American soil.
Now, I stated in the 9/11 20th anniversary, like a conspiracy theory 20th anniversary video, that I believe that there is some level of, probably at the highest level, the monarchy in Saudi Arabia, the king and crown prince. There was probably, maybe not the crown prince, because 20 years ago he would have been very young, but high level government officials, along with the royal family and the crown family themselves, probably had some awareness of what was going on, with like a wink and a nod. So they aren't necessarily driving the intelligence operation, and they might not always be brought in on it, but it's an assumption, just based on how something like this would probably work in a country like that they would have some awareness. They wouldn't be completely unaware, and it might even be something that's not signaled verbally. It's something, again, with a wink and a nod, that it has to be kept so under the table because they can't have any connection, that they, are let in on it basically under the table, without verbal recognition, without really kind of going over the top and saying, hey, this is happening in America, this is going to happen. And there are reasons as to why this would be beneficial, actually, for Saudi Arabia, despite them being the United States ally. It would seem to have benefited them significantly, and we're about to see, for the U.S. to have actually come into the Middle East as, a partner that is there. I can think of numerous reasons that the U.S. being in the region, just as it would be good for Israel, I can think why it would be good for Saudi Arabia. Being that Iran is so directly in opposition to Saudi Arabia, and they still are today. I mean, it's a religious issue. You can't really cover this subject without getting into religion, because of how prevalent and how connected it all is. But with Saudi Arabia and Iran, it's an issue of Sunni versus Shia, and you have the leaders in Sunni Islam, Saudi Arabia, and the leaders in Shia Islam, Iran, in direct conflict with each other. Additionally, always remember how prevalent Saudi Arabia is to Sunni Islam and Islam as, just the whole totality of it, because Mecca and Medina are in Saudi Arabia. So that's very important. Those are the holiest places in Islam. So let's continue to watch and see how this wraps up.
Of course, the Saudi government says they welcome this declassification, and of course they had absolutely nothing to do with it. But if there's one thing that's clear about the way that people have been lied to over these many years, I think this document shows you the way that bipartisan administrations, Bush, Obama, Trump, worked to cover up some of these connections to Saudi officials who were at least in contact routinely with some of these hijackers.
It still just shows what a joke the 9/11 Commission is.
Oh.
And, I'm doing my entire monologue on kind of a retrospective on how terrible, actually, that the Bush administration screwed up the response to 9/11 and then drove us into the war in Iraq. And on the 20th anniversary, it really is so important that we still try to get to the bottom of this, because it's just like what we're experiencing now with the Wuhan stuff.
Yeah.
You know, actually, yesterday was the 2-year anniversary to date that the database at the Wuhan Institute of Virology was just miraculously taken off, which had described the bat and rat pathogens that they happen to have there. Oh, it's just gone, you know, because of cybersecurity threats is what they claim. Oh, and then all of a sudden, you know, you start to see all kinds of crazy little infections pop up in 2019, just a month after this entire incident. Are we ever going to get to the bottom of it? Or it's going to be like this? Are Crystal and Sagar 20 years from now going to be doing a segment?
Remembering the lies and the cover-ups.
President Donald Trump Jr., God help us, has declassified, President Barron at that time, Barron Trump, at that time has declassified.
Barron Trump, after a long and storied NBA career, when this comes to when this comes true, who said it first?
A document.
I got a little bit of hope for Barron. I think he would declassify.
He's very tall. You know, he's got a lot of energy. So, I mean, you go and it's like, are we going to be doing segments 20 years from now on like TikTok or whatever on Chinese Global, since they rule the world, about how they, you know, the Wuhan Institute of Virology and somebody's declassified this document. That's what it feels like. It's just, it's so crazy to me. That's all this information, all of these documents and more completely covered up, and that they covered it up intentionally so that we could go to war in Iraq.
Well, and that's it. And this is actually a good segue to the next segment. 15 of the 19 hijackers were from Saudi.
Right.
Remember that. And somehow we end up in war in Iraq.
Yeah.
This was my point in the previous video. My point actually was somehow we ended up in a war in Afghanistan, but we already just based off, you know, the most prevalent conspiracy theorists at the time, William Cooper, saying about a month and a half before 9/11 that they're going to blame something on Osama bin Laden. It appears to me that there was some awareness that this guy, who I suppose they know he's in Afghanistan. He was there in 1997. It doesn't look like he moved that much. It would appear that he, was a known entity to the intelligence services, not just in the United States, but probably to various entities. And, you know, again, that if they really wanted, they could have tracked him down. I don't think it just lands on a bureaucratic failure that they never got Osama bin Laden. I think that there's reasons to allow him to do this stuff. Those reasons are probably going to be more evident when you look at the spending since 9/11 on the war on terror and how much money has been given to contractors and, foreign nations and just all sorts of different entities that, otherwise this money wouldn't have been there. And, even when I go over the 9/11 in pop culture Hollywood video that I'm going to do a video on, one of the movies, The Long Kiss Goodnight, is, I think, a great foreshadowing of this. It's a movie that came out in 1996, and basically it's that the Defense Department, CIA, some agency, some intelligence agency, has like a rogue high-level operative who essentially wants more money for his department so that they can defend people more. So he decides he's going to commit a terrorist attack in Niagara Falls in New York. And, he's like, you can't, pretend like you killed 4,000 people. So I guess we're just going to have to do it ourselves. And we're going to blame it on the Muslims, no doubt, that kind of thing. I mean, that's paraphrasing, but I mean, that's literally what I say. Literally, it's a paraphrase of what he says, but he does say they're going to blame it on Muslims. He does insinuate it's a false flag attack in New York, not New York City, but in New York, that kills like 4,000 people. And the idea of it is to fundraise essentially for, the CIA or whatever division he works for. So I don't think it's that out of question that there's people who are connected at these highest levels of the intelligence services and of government that would want to do this stuff. So again, remember, basically she's saying, why, if 15 of the hijackers were from Saudi Arabia, why do we end up in Iraq? And my point is, why do we end up in Afghanistan? And, the greater point is, why did we end up in either, with a never-ending war on terror, which it looks like the next target of the never-ending war on terror is exactly what William Cooper, in that same video that I've covered several times and previously, that same June 28th, 2001 Hour of the Time, he's talking about patriots, like American citizens, specifically even former military members, veterans, and, groups, patriot groups here in America, not, white militia people. Like, that's the general idea that you hear on the news and from other sources, but just people who don't want the United States to be manipulated by higher levels of government, like world government, and be, kind of irrelevant in the scheme of things. And that those are the people who are going to be targeted next using this moniker of terrorist. So it first starts off with Islam and, foreign terrorists over there. And then it becomes domestic terrorism here. And it's, I would assume the first thing is they started off with this idea that, it's just white militia groups. Then you start to realize it's like a weaponization of fear. And, like I say in my previous videos on 9/11 here, there's plenty of people of all diverse backgrounds and ethnicities that want to protect America from this, because they, with any bit of wisdom, you can see that it ends in something not good. It ends in a situation maybe reminiscent of what's going on in China, where you can literally have 1 million Uyghur Muslims in concentration camps, like modern day re-education camps, and there's a great firewall, and that kind of thing. It's not out of the realm of possibility in America if things spiral out of control. And we have a lot of freedom here that, some people don't like. I mean, in the sense that, you can discuss things open and freely. You can't do that in a lot of countries. You can't have your own opinions really publicly in other countries. We're blessed here in America, and that's one of the things I think that this is actually a war on, is to change that eventually. But let's get back into it. Remember she's talking about, how do we get into Iraq if there were 15 of the hijackers were Saudi Arabian? Go.
And somehow we end up in war in Iraq.
Yeah.
And bin Laden's hiding out in Afghanistan. They offer to turn him over, and we're like, nah, we're good.
Now, prior, I think when they went and visited in 1997, like the CNN interviewed him, and he had declared a jihad on America. And remember, it's all related to Israel. It's our tacit support of Israel, our support of Israel, our the occupation, the Zionist occupation, quote unquote, and the encroachment of Western powers and Western civilization, and anything other than Islam and Muslims in the Saudi Arabian Peninsula close to Mecca and Medina. That was the reason given. Now, at the time, I don't think the tribal peoples of Afghanistan would have given bin Laden up. After what happened, as they're saying, it's my understanding that they offered to give him up. But basically the United States was like, no, this is a hotbed for terrorism, and we can't, we didn't know that they could operate out of here like this, which, again, if William Cooper's super famous conspiracy theorist is saying, this is clearly happening, like, give me enough resources, I'll get the guy out. And this is before 9/11 happens, and he's like, yeah, remember, they're going to blame something on bin Laden, and it's going to be like the Reichstag in Nazi Germany, and they're going to use it to blame on different groups, and then, basically, kind of what happened. Just remember all this stuff. You have to have this narrative that includes some of these things that happen in order for this to make a little more sense, I think. So, but, they probably would have given bin Laden up without a fight, right? And after seeing what happened over the past 20 years, how we just gave it back to the Taliban with, now they have more weapons than ever. And an arsenal of American-made military machines. It's like, whether they know how to use and maintain them, that's not the point. They have way more than they have ever had as far as resources go, and that's partially because of this. I saw a video, just last thing, of some guy in Afghanistan, I believe, probably an official video that the Taliban wanted to show, propaganda type thing. They did that thing where they put on U.S. uniforms and mocked the raising of the flag at Iwo Jima. Well, there's a guy sitting there in a room, and it's just stacks of cash, unopened in plastic wrappers. You can tell there it's off the printing press that the U.S. just sent stacks of cash over to Afghanistan for the government to use, stacks of U.S. dollars. And he's going through it, and he's just brrr, and it's just stacks of thousands of dollars because they're all $100 bills. And each stack is, my assumption is $10,000, $100,000. I mean, $50,000, something like that. And there's just stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks and stacks on stacks on stacks on stacks. That's what went to the Taliban as we just left. Do you think it would have benefited them as much if we hadn't done all this for 20 years? I mean, look at what if we had just gotten him because they had given him up, they probably wouldn't have all this stuff. They'd probably be, pretty broke. Look at what happened in Vietnam. The communism did not succeed in Vietnam, right? Vietnam is had to westernize in order to, get to some level of modernity, right? And it just, it's an ideology that didn't succeed over there. Similarly, I don't think that 20 years of Taliban rule would have succeeded as well as, now there's lots of reasons for people to be as part of this regime against America because we were the occupiers, and we, I say we, the United States was the occupiers. I didn't go do it. I wouldn't have done it the same. I would have done it like she's saying, where you just, yeah, sure, we'll take them. Thanks. Anyway, let's continue to watch.
Now we're good. Well, we feeling so hubristic that we're good. Guns hiding out in Afghanistan. They offer to turn him over, and we're like, nah, we're good. Now we're good. Well, we feeling so hubristic that we thought we can crush the Taliban, remake Afghanistan, spread democracy, all of this nonsense. And of course, by the way, secure lots of military wealth and trillions upon trillions of dollars in fees for military contractors and military industrial complex. It is such a crime.
That's the next video I'm going to do is, the fees that these contractors have gotten. But just one more thing. Did that work in Vietnam? We have a direct example of how Vietnam played out. Was the thing that ultimately westernized Vietnam and brought capitalism to Vietnam, was it the war, or was it just the reality of the ideology of communism failing? It's probably the second thing, right? Because the war didn't seem to actually, be the impetus for change, because after the war there was communism for a while, right? And then, well, that fell.
That has been committed to this country, what has been done to these people, the surveillance that was justified, the breach of civil liberties that will never be rolled back that was justified by all of this, the complete destabilization of an entire region, the fact that we made ourselves so much less safe. We helped to generate new terrorist groups. We made the Taliban more powerful than they've ever been before.
ISIS.
That's the real legacy. And every year when 9/11 rolls around, I think to myself, if we had done nothing in response, we would have been infinitely better off, and the world would have been infinitely better off than the actions that George W. Bush caused us to take. Hey guys, thanks.
Now remember, thanks Crystal and Sagar. Now remember, in my previous video, I covered specifically this point. Let her say it again real fast.
If we had done nothing in response, we would have been infinitely better off.
If we had just gotten bin Laden, right? I mean, nothing maybe is... If we had just taken bin Laden when he was offered to us and then brought him to justice, I think that would have been, you know... What does it say at the end of the Bible? There's a burning lake? Okay, that might have been wise. You want to deal with these things. That's why it's cooked into the Bible as like the worst punishment possible. But anyway, you know, we probably would have saved, and I'm gonna look at this in an upcoming video that I might record right after this. It's like the budgetary. I included this. If you go into here, this is the Watson Brown, like Brown University Watson School. Watson Institute International and Public Affairs. It's like an estimate of the spending. And even after I posted this, you know, Crystal and Sagar in this video talk about the war profits. So it seems like even more was spent. But $8 trillion plus $2.2 trillion in veteran care over the next 30 years. So that's like $10 trillion. Plus, think about the $2.3 trillion adjusted for inflation, like $3 trillion that Donald Rumsfeld announced was like unaccounted for in the Pentagon budget office right before it was hit on 9/11, like literally the day before it was hit on 9/11. I mean, that's trillions and trillions and trillions of dollars. Like, how much money could have been spent here in America developing the United States and further advancing us? Like, could we have been further technologically? Could we have been further, you know, every American could have gotten a little chunk of change from that. But even more so, you could develop the infrastructure and pay off mortgages so that people can actually start affording their own thing. You can pay off student loans. Like all this stuff that people are complaining about, like, well, people don't, you know, they're not working, so they don't deserve this stuff. Well, it's like, you know, who doesn't deserve it? People who are like wasting resources in war. And this is not on any military, you know, guys, like any veterans or anything. These are the people at the high levels, right? The ones who, you know, are the decision makers, not the, you know, guys who go out there, the hitters. These are the, you know, the old men who send young men to war, basically. That's what I'm getting at. And then the human cost. Like, look at the human cost. Thousands of American lives, hundreds of thousands of civilian and national police and military members, just in like journalists, NGO workers, civilians, NGO fighter, like opposition fighters. Look at the total is almost 1 million, right? I mean, as far as the number of people killed directly in violence of the U.S. post 9/11 wars in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, and elsewhere, estimated here. Almost 1 million. I mean, think about that. That's a lot of people. And directly correlated to what happened on 9/11. So we'll get more into the cost of the war and who profited in the video where I cover that. I'm going to be watching this, how defense contractors, Congress, this from 5 hours ago, made trillions off war on terror. But I think one last thing I'd like to look at is, I saw this video pop up in my feed, and this is a Christian channel that looks at Israel. it's kind of the state of Israel through the eyes of, like, you know, the Christian Watchman, right? But I thought this was interesting. This says Israel to share missile defense systems with Saudi Arabia as Houthi terror grows. What? I mean, like, actually, as you know, 20 years ago, like, Israel's existence is now being, you know, accepted by Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia to the point where they coordinate together on military stuff, like through back channels or whatever. But this is like directly seeming that they're going to make some kind of probably greater, more public reconciliation, right? And remember, Osama bin Laden said specifically Israel is the reason 9/11 happened. In the sense that because the United States supported Israel, we were enemies, right? Because Western civilization encroached on Mecca and Medina in Saudi Arabia and then the Arabian Peninsula. America was the enemy, right? So let's watch a little of this at least and see what he has to say.
Today on the newscast, a major Middle East story this week that you probably have not heard of, but it could end up making history. Find out what it is next. Hey folks, Eric Stackelbeck here. Welcome to the Watchman Newscast. We had some major news out of the Middle East this week that the mainstream media largely ignored, but we have it for you today here on the Watchman Newscast. An online magazine called Breaking Defense had the scoop earlier this week that Saudi Arabia is considering buying missile defense systems from Israel. This is major news that could have historic implications. I do not say that lightly. According to this online magazine, Breaking Defense, the Saudis are considering purchasing Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system, which focuses mainly on intercepting short-range missiles, and also the Barak-ER missile defense system, Israeli-made, which focuses on intercepting cruise missiles. Now, the deal is not finalized, but apparently the Saudis and Israelis are having at least back-channel talks about making this a reality.
Now, let's look back here. This is like Iron Dome, right? This is like a proprietary system that was created in Israel to defend against, you know, Palestinian and Lebanese, I believe. Like, you know, basically the enemies of Israel shooting short-range rockets like Hamas and whatever other forces want to shoot rockets randomly into Israel. This is meant to, like, shoot down those rockets, right? And from my understanding, it's pretty, you know, advanced as compared to a lot of missile defense systems, right? At least it was. And the fact that Israel is willing to share it with an Arab nation actually is, I mean, whether they are or not, this is speculation at this point, but if they are, that's pretty wild to me. Like, just one of the reasons is because, well, if you could back engineer it and find its weaknesses, I mean, that would be, you know, if you want to, like, subvert the Iron Dome system, you could do that. But maybe, right? But it just additionally, like, you know, this is Saudi Arabia. Like, they aren't traditionally seen as a direct ally of Israel. In fact, they aren't even part of the Abraham Accords, which we're going to get into, but it just sounds like it's literally the next chapter in this video, so we're going to click to that and watch it. But it's just pretty wild. And additionally, they said when he went over this, it's like this is maybe the Barak missile system. That has nothing to do with Obama. Obama's name is a Hebrew word that means to bless. And so, yeah. Anyway, Barak means to bless in Hebrew. All right, let's watch this.
And folks, when I say this is historic, I do not say that lightly. Number one, Saudi Arabia and Israel do not have official diplomatic relations as of now. There have, of course, been rumblings that we've talked about a lot here on the newscast over the past year that perhaps the Saudis will join the Abraham Accords, that historic peace treaty that Israel has struck between itself and Arab neighbors, Sunni Arab neighbors like the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Sudan, Morocco. By the way, we just passed on September 15th, Wednesday of this week, the one-year anniversary of the signing of the Abraham Accords at the White House under President Trump. I was honored to be in attendance. It was quite a day. But I remember on that day, 1 year ago, that many of us were talking about, okay, who's next? Who will come into the fold next and come into the Abraham Accords agreement with Israel? And the big one we were all talking about was Saudi Arabia, for obvious reasons. It is probably the most important place in Islam, where Mecca and
It is absolutely the most important place in Islam. It is literally, this is where you are required to take a pilgrimage. This is why religion plays such a key role in the discussion of all this. This is a requirement for any Muslim who can afford to do this. You are to take a pilgrimage to Mecca. I mean, so like you come here, you complete your pilgrimage, you walk around the cube. There's a black stone in it. I think you kiss the black stone if you can. That's, I would say that's idolatrous, but they say believing Jesus is is Yahweh, who is God, is idolatrous. So I mean, I suppose it's a difference of opinion, though. One is kissing a stone, and like it's literally a stone, maybe a meteorite. Anyway, this is super important in Islam, right? It's literally a requirement. All right, let's continue.
Medina, the two holy sites in Islam, are located. The Saudis see themselves as the guardians of Mecca.
I will say, very beautiful. Like, as far as the Arctic, they have a lot of money to spend on it, though. Lots of oil money. That was part of my point in the previous video. You might drop some of your religious beliefs if that's how much money you're poised to make, and how much power you're poised to make based on connecting with the United States or Israel or whatever. So the zeal that once existed for keeping Israel non-existent essentially as a state. Well, look at all the nice architecture we can develop. It's sacred. Okay, anyway, let's finish this up.
Islam are located. The Saudis see themselves as the guardians of Mecca and Medina. It is a pivotal country.
Let me say one more thing. There's even an idea that Israel would rather have the Saudi Arabian government connected to the Temple Mount, possibly gaining greater freedom for Jews to go and worship on the Temple Mount, which is literally the holy place for Jewish people, as opposed to it's the third holiest place in Islam, and it only has a nebulous connection to being the real Al-Aqsa Mosque, which maybe historically didn't exist until it became relevant and decidedly important that, the Temple Mount might have fallen into Jewish hands. So it would be like reasonable for Islam to say, no, that's important to us, so you can't touch it. Because, seemingly what happens with these things. But, the idea is that maybe Saudi Arabia would be the keepers, because right now it's Jordan, and from my understanding, the Hashemite kingdom, right? Like the monarchy, the king of Jordan and that, group looks over the Temple Mount. But, I think Saudi Arabia, from my understanding, is like positioning themselves to be the ones who do that and kind of usurp Jordan and the Hashemite monarchy in that regard. And it's important because then Saudi Arabia would have control of the first, second, and third, really the only three, like the main three holy sites in Islam. They would have, basically direct authority over these places. So, all right, let's, and remember, Christians and Jews cannot go to the Temple Mount other than on certain, like at certain times on certain days. I'm not even sure if, like, I think Christians have to be specially allowed. I think Jews have a specific time that they can go in. But if you're Muslim, you can go in whenever. I mean, it's weird to me because it has no religious significance, actually. Al-Aqsa isn't even confirmed to be, despite what you might hear, the Temple Mount complex. It just, remember, the Dome of the Rock is not Al-Aqsa. It's a different part of the Temple Mount complex. But it I believe early in the 19th century and 20th century, it wasn't, considered necessarily where Al-Aqsa actually was. I mean, that should tell you something there. And no one denied at that point that the temple was the Temple of Solomon, or the temple, the site of the first and second temples that were built to Yahweh by Solomon. That wasn't denied in Islamic thought. And then eventually, as these things came to conflict more, it did become like way more taboo for Islamic sources or groups to say that's where the Temple of Solomon is. Why? Because that would give the Jews, the Jewish people, and Israel a legitimate claim on the Temple Mount. And, part of it is Judaism and Christianity precede Islam by, the end of the Christian Bible was written at least 600 years before, how about this? At least 500 years before the Quran was written. And, the rebuttal you'll hear is, what? So you think Islam only popped up in the 7th century? All historical evidence says yes. There's no historical evidence that shows Islam existed before the Quran was written in like 610 or whenever it was written. It clearly didn't exist. I mean, actually, it is a, this isn't even the place to get into it. It didn't exist. And so this is why you see these countries all posturing like this. It's all like, who gets control over this religious context? Because if you can control that, even if you have a ton of money, you don't control people necessarily. But if you can control the religion, then you control people. That's just how it is, sadly. I think Christianity speaks kind of against these concepts. True religion is, keep yourself like unstained from the world and visit orphans and widows in their distress. That's what Jesus says. But to other religions, you got to go do things. Like, you got to go to this place and worship, and you got to worship like this, and you got to do this. And so you can control people if you have control over these different sites. And so this posturing over the past 20 years and how people have strategically moved on the 4D chessboard that is the world is, way more obvious if you understand the religious connections. So I've sat on this picture for too long and talked about religion for too long, probably, but it is super important to this topic. It's hard to, separate 9/11, the war on terror, Islam, Judaism, Christianity, the Middle East. It's very hard to keep these, things separate. So let's continue.
See themselves as the guardians of Mecca and Medina. It is a pivotal country on many levels, to say the least. This is a start. The defense, security, and intelligence cooperation that Saudi Arabia and Israel have engaged in over the past few years. And we did have a meeting, reportedly a back-channel in-person meeting back in November 2020 between the former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS.
Now, there's something I want to look at real fast. He was talking about, and you can see here, this says Saudi Arabia to join the Abraham Accords, right? Like, the Abraham Accords is this idea that Israel and, a number of Gulf Arab nations and, just really like Muslim majority Arab nations and Muslim majority nations would recognize Israel and their right to exist and start trade with them and, normalize relations essentially. And part of the idea is, Judaism is an Abrahamic religion and Islam is an Abrahamic religion. Islam follows Allah. Judaism, the idea, at least originally, was that it followed Yahweh, though again, or Yah. Again, that name doesn't particularly come up as much, but it at its heart, that's what it is, right? And at its heart, Islam doesn't recognize Allah as the name of God. It doesn't recognize Yahweh as the name of God or Yah as the name of God. It recognizes Allah, though Allah has many of the, it is basically usurps Yahweh's position. Etymologically, Allah comes seemingly from the word Al, Elohim, Eloah, and any God in the Bible, like whether it be Yahweh, the true God of Israel, right, or false gods, are called El or Eloah or Elohim. Elohim is used for, basically spiritual entities or deities, and El is an Al, and the name Allah might just pretty obviously come from Eloah, and that just moving into Arabic as a language, from Hebrew into Arabic. But then you have, they claim Al-Ilah. Well, another word, Elion or Ile in Hebrew is like the Most High deity, right? And that's a title specifically for Yahweh, but that might have been taken by this deity, which again has some of the characteristics of Yahweh, but some key points, which would make or break whether it is the same deity. They disagree and contradict each other, and not just Judaism and Islam, but Christianity and Islam. And specifically, again, Christians believe in Yahweh. That is the one God that Christians follow. They just believe the Jeremiah 23:5-6 thing, where Yahweh says he's going to come as the righteous branch of David. This righteous branch of David is going to be called Yahweh. It's the only other character in the Bible called Yahweh. That's what Christians believe. And that the spirit of Yahweh, which is called exactly that, is Yahweh, because Yahweh is a spirit, right? That hovered over the water. So it's all one thing. It's all one deity, entity named Yahweh. And that's what Christians believe ultimately at the heart of it, right? Whereas, Jewish people don't acknowledge that Jesus is this Jeremiah 23:5-6 figure, the righteous branch of David. He's just some guy. That's the difference basically between Judaism and Christianity. Whereas Islam and Judaism, very different. Here's one of the main differences. That I said all that to get to this point. Remember the Abraham Accords. Abraham has 2 children. The children are Ishmael, the firstborn, and Isaac. Now, in Judeo-Christian tradition, meaning in the Bible, Isaac is the one who inherits the promise, who is almost sacrificed by Abraham. In Christian thought, he's like a forerunner of to see whether Abraham would do what Yahweh does, in the idea that he sends his only son to die, would as a sacrifice, right? Would Abraham do the same? And to Jewish people, the idea is that he represents this promise, a faithful servant of Yahweh who truly believed and who, followed him actually, and that the descendants of him were to be blessed, and that's where the Jewish people come from. But the Jewish people, as well as Christian thought and everything, come from Isaac. Whereas in Islam, Ishmael is herd of El, herd of God, herd of Al, like Allah, right? Herd of Al, herd of El, is the figure which most, I think, in Islamic thought, it says, though it is generally believed by modern Muslims that Ishmael was the son who was almost sacrificed. And you can see here that it says, though the Quran does not mention the name of this son that Abraham was told to sacrifice. It does say Muslims believe that Abraham was told to sacrifice his son Ishmael. And that is basically like the other son, right? And so Jews and Christians like come from this lineage with the ideas of Isaac, and I would say Jews like make the claim ethnically that they come, through this line, and Christians say like it's a spiritual representation of that is spoken of in the New Testament. You can look it up, but that the two represent spiritual realities. One is born to the slave woman Hagar, the other is born to the free woman Sarah, whose name means like princess, right? So you get the idea. One is born of a slave woman, the other's born of the promise by Yahweh to Abraham that he would have children, and that is the one who's born of the princess Sarah, right? And so, or Sarai was her name, and then her name gets changed to Sarah. Anyway, that's what this thing comes down to. And you'll see here that genealogy and association, Ishmael's place as the founder of the Arabs was first stated by Josephus. So this becomes a thing where the idea is that it says, as Islam became established, the figure Ishmael and those descended from him, the Ishmaelites, became connected and often equated with the term Arab in early Jewish and Christian literature. I will say, I believe there's literally a word that you could probably etymologically is Arab, and it has something to do with mixing in the like Hebrew Old Testament. But the idea of like Arabs is biblical later on in the prophets, and early on, I believe the idea is that he very likely is this forerunner of Arabs, and forerunner, especially like you look at it, Islam seems to claim him as the one that Christianity and Judaism like identify with Isaac. And additionally, last part of this is there's a connection between Abraham, Ishmael, and Mecca, and the Kaaba, and this pilgrimage that Muslims have to take to Mecca and Medina, and the Hajj. And again, prior to the Quranic accounts, like when the Quran was written, there's no archaeological evidence that this is what happened. There's plenty of archaeological evidence that there's a temple where the Temple Mount is, that there was a temple, that there was an ancient Israel. There's literally like seals that they find with minor characters, names written on it, like stewards of a king mentioned in Jeremiah or something. They find those seals throughout Israel and throughout Jerusalem and stuff. This kind of stuff, there is not archaeological evidence for this. But if you can assert with enough power and money that this is reality, and you can use these back channel things, and you can basically make it so that they have to Israel kind of needs or wants Saudi Arabia to be connected via this Abraham Accord. So again, you might drop some of the importance of religion on both sides, whether Islam or Judaism, in order to facilitate some of your desired outcomes, right? So I guess let's finish up this video, but my whole point here is that the Abraham Accords this is why this is relevant. And this is seemingly what all this 20-year war was leading up to, right? So, all right, let's watch.
Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, former Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu, and the Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, also known as MBS. Former Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was also present for those meetings.
In a back channel
Former
meeting.
Trump administration officials that I have spoken to said, hey, if President Trump had a second term in office, the Saudis by now would have already come to the table and joined the Abraham Accords. But that is not the case. But still, perhaps the Saudis will eventually join the Abraham Accords.
I just want to say, you know, to all the people that think Trump is like a righteous Christian, I'm not going to sit here and judge his heart because Yahweh, God knows that, right? That's my belief. But the guy referred to 2 Corinthians as 2 Corinthians when he says that's where his favorite Bible verse is, or that's his favorite book or whatever. I mean, you can find the interview. It doesn't sound to me like he's as devout of a believer as a lot of you know, Trumplicans would like to think. And, you know, I try to not fall on either side of the red-blue divide because I see most of it as a manipulation tactic, you know, used to divide America and yield little movement in the advance of our nation. So that's where I stand. Let's keep watching.
Buying Israeli missile defense systems, potentially, again, it's not a done deal, but potentially, and even considering it, is a major step to my mind in that direction, because you know there would be backlash, of course, inside Saudi Arabia by some of the Saudi population to this move, and of course, the neighbors, meaning the Iranian regime. You have the good neighbors and you have the bad actors in the region like Iran and its proxies would be furious over this and lash out at Saudi Arabia. More on that in a second. A little bit more backdrop to this potential. Again,
I would also assume it would inflame some other nations like Turkey. So, I mean, this would be a big deal. And, like, you gotta realize, like, they would get this. First of all, Saudi Aramco's oil fields in, like, 2019 were hit by a drone attack. They just sent a bunch of drones, and possibly from Iran, right? Or Yemen, like the Houthi rebels in Yemen. But it was like a somewhat sophisticated attack. They used just an overwhelming amount of drones and it got through the air defense system. And they were able to, like, basically knock out oil production for a day, which, I mean, you got to think that costs a lot of money, just even for 1 day worth of it being knocked out. So, yeah, that's why this would be a big deal to have these Iron Dome systems, is it would shoot down those kind of, like, you know, I think the, like, large barrage of drones being sent in. That it's kind of like a mindless way of attacking. But it seems to be effective, especially if you're trying to do some kind of economic warfare that, you know, oh, we spend a couple million on these drones and they lose a couple $100 million in oil production for a couple days or something, or a day. I mean, so if they spend a couple $100 million buying these air defense systems, they don't have to worry about that, right? I think that's the idea. Additionally, it might protect them from some other threats. So additionally, they could probably also, you know, back engineer them and figure out, you know, ways to defeat them just so they have a check on Israel. I mean, there's a number of reasons why they might want to get these things.
Again,
and my thought is, if Israel's selling them, Israel probably has more advanced versions that they use with proprietary stuff that they would not give to anybody. That's just a guess.
Word there, Saudi purchase of Israeli missile defense systems. Remember, we reported here in the newscast earlier this week that the Biden administration has removed U.S. missile defense systems from Saudi Arabia. We had the Patriot missile batteries stationed around the Saudi capital of Riyadh over the past few years, and now they have been removed by the United States. Now, they will say, that Biden administration officials, that it's part of their pivot to counter the China and Russia threat, but you have to scratch your heads, folks, because at any time, there's been no time like the present for the Saudis to have missile defense. Why? We've been talking about this a lot, right, over the past few months. The absolute onslaught by those Iran-backed Houthi rebels against Saudi Arabia in the form of attack drones.
This is the kind of drones that they send in. By the way, my guess is that the United States is, like, while the Middle East is still clearly important, just reading what was the news today, that, like, the United States announced that along with Australia and I think the UK and some of the nations. Basically, the United States is forming a bloc against China in the South Pacific. And like, they've already been doing that for a while. But today, China and France, for whatever reason, France, I don't know, why would France come out and be against this? It's clear that like the United States is shifting, in my opinion, their priority from the Middle East to the South Pacific. And so this is like a use of resources that the military doesn't want to have to like have in the Middle East. They would rather this kind of stuff and like these kind of resources and the eyes and the surveillance and all that. They would rather that be used in the South Pacific to counter China, which, China's rapidly developing military power. I mean, that makes some logical sense, but it just like what's going on in this region of the world is also a little concerning if you just know, like what's going on. And then additionally, if you have some kind of idea of like what prophecy states from the Bible. Anyway, I mean, that's my personal belief. You can believe what you want, but it seems like these things are developing in a way which is like, yeah, this 2,000-year-old prophecy and Revelation and the book of Daniel are starting to look way more realistic. I mean, let me say this. Before my parents were born, both of them, before Israel existed as a state. Like the modern day Israel existed as a state. I mean, that blows my mind every time I hear it. Like, I mean, every time I think about it, like, oh yeah, I guess Israel becoming a state is pretty brand new in the scheme of, world history and things. Huh. Okay. Well, yeah, I guess for 2,000 years, these things couldn't have happened, but it looks like any day now, like Saudi Arabia makes this deal with Israel and they normalize relations. And then one of the things that they announce is they're going to allow the Jewish people to build a third temple. I mean, that's it. That's what, that is, at least to Christians, that's like the sign. Like, well, once there's a third temple with sacrifices, those sacrifices can be stopped and all the stuff from, Revelation and the other stuff, that can all play out, like just in physical reality, whether there's spiritual realities that it's talking about, but definitely like this is the thing that has been missing for 2,000 years and it looks like it's headed that way. I mean, just again, eyes, ears, it's hard to separate religion from this. That's why it's important to know all these things, whether you're coming from a secular standpoint or not. If you had said, oh yeah, Israel would exist and it would look like it, by this point they were going to be building a third temple sometime in the future, possibly, people would have said you were crazy. And then, if you had said that to my grandparents, well, they might not have known what you were talking about because, who knows about this stuff. But, like, if you had said it to anybody, well-informed about religion and geopolitics, they would have been like, no, that's not going to happen. And then, oh, well, Israel's now a state again. 80 years later, looks like we're getting pretty close to that temple. I mean, just it does. So, okay, let's keep watching.
Drones and ballistic missiles, over 240 attacks this year alone, carried out by the Houthis against Saudi Arabia. Now, many times the Saudis will say, hey, we shot down the drone or we shot down the missile, our missile defense systems. But for the U.S. to remove its highly advanced missile defense systems, to my mind, is obviously a blow to those Saudi defenses against this Houthi onslaught, an Iran-backed onslaught, by the way. So it's really no surprise in the grand scheme of things that Saudi Arabia is considering now purchasing some of the best technology there is, Israel's Iron Dome missile defense system and Israel's other missile defense systems. All of this that we're talking about today is part of what I call the Afghanistan effect. What is that? Well, the United States beat that hasty withdrawal, a disastrous, chaotic withdrawal, an absolute debacle.
Notice he's saying, well, this is all like, listen to what he's saying. This is why this is important. We're watching this, this video starts off and this is what it's going to be about. But we got to Israel sharing missile defense with Saudi Arabia because what he's about to say, right?
Missile defense systems. All of this that we're talking about today is part of what I call the Afghanistan effect. What is that? Well, the United States beat that hasty withdrawal, a disastrous, chaotic withdrawal, an absolute debacle out of Afghanistan in the past few weeks, and it left a stain on the United States' reputation in the eyes of the world under the Biden White House. Number one, our friends no longer believe they can trust us or count on us, and our adversaries no longer fear or respect us or respect any consequences for their bad behaviors.
I wouldn't say that necessarily, and I don't think Trump was above just leaving Afghanistan disastrously, but I will say, like, this was a bad decision, the way they did it, and again, I think they still realize America's pretty strong when it comes to the military power. What they also realize is, man, they make some bad decisions with that military power. Can we manipulate that? Can we, if your enemy is big, right? I think this is like, an idea in warfare, with guerrilla warfare, right? If your enemy is big and you're small, use what you can to their detriment. Like use every try to manipulate their lack of mobility or their decision making processes or whatever, because there's a whole bureaucratic line that has to go down, and there's logistics, and there's that can that be manipulated? Like that is what comes out of this, is like, how can we make this a PR nightmare back home so that support for these things goes away, and that they're just spending all this money and these people don't want to be here, and that's what you get out of this. Less so that they don't, most countries realize, yeah, the United States is probably more powerful than they've ever been militarily. They spend so much money on the military, it's absurd. Like, actually, we spend, just looking at this, we've spent 14 trillion. Pentagon spending has totaled over 14 trillion since the start of the war in Afghanistan. No country, I'd be willing to bet no country comes close. And that's not even including our DARPA and black budget stuff. So I mean, really, I think most countries realize it would be hard to go in a direct conflict, but if you can do things with wisdom or intelligence circumspectly, you can kind of cause problems for even such a large and powerful force.
So right now, the Saudis are feeling a bit nervous, without a doubt. And like Egypt, Jordan, the UAE, Bahrain, the Saudis look at the region. They scan what's going on in the Middle East right now, the world's most chaotic and volatile region. And they see Israel as the strong horse. They see Israel as the one nation that is willing to stand up to the Iranian regime and Iranian expansionism in the region. That's the major reason, really, for the Abraham Accords, that shared Iran threat. The Sunni Arab nations and Israel are both very wary of that Iranian arc that is.
So, again, like I've been saying, you can't separate religion, because it's Shia Islam in Iran and their proxies and anybody else who would stand with them. Sunni Islam led by Saudi Arabia, basically, the rest of the Gulf Arab nations, and all these other countries that are Muslim majority, essentially. Like, that's how this stacks up. And remember, Iran at one point was Persia, and there was an Islamic revolution there. And then, this is... And remember, again, it's 100% sects of the same religion. I mean, wow.
Stretching from Tehran, across Iraq, Yemen, Syria, and Lebanon, not only at Israel's doorstep, but at Jordan's doorstep, at Saudi Arabia's doorstep.
Iran is Persia in the Bible, right? In the Old Testament, they're Persia. That's what they, some people still consider them Persian. Like some Iranians don't want to be called Iranian; they barely be called Persian because, like, culturally, I think they're Persian, right? And that's like the history, right? And biblically, I think when it talks about like Persia, that's who it's talking about, and that if this group is set to do something against, like a prophecy or something. You look at like Gog and Magog, for example. It's this prophecy where a whole bunch of different countries ally and attack Israel. One of those main countries is Persia. Why would that be? Like today, what would that be? Oh, that sounds like it would be Iran to me. And so I don't even without the prophetic, like, looking into the Bible thing, it still looks like Persia, aka Iran, wants to be this entity that is going against Israel, because Israel is the little Satan and America is the great Satan. That's how, the hardliners in Iran talk about it, right? So, I mean, come on, like, legitimately, it's playing out pretty much like the book is saying. Even if you remove the book from the equation, it's still playing out that way.
And Egypt, I can tell you, Naftali Bennett, the Israeli prime minister, met with Egyptian President el-Sisi in recent days, and both of them were talking about not only the Iran nuclear threat, but continued Hamas terror out of Gaza. So shared threats across the board between the Sunni Arab nations and Israel. Saudi Arabia, Israel, hey, there may be a lot of differences, obviously, but they certainly share a growing concern over the budding Iranian Shia nuclear superpower to the east. So that's some of the backdrop and some of the dynamics going on right now. We will keep you posted if we hear anything about this. I encourage you to check out the article online. Again, it's an online magazine called Breaking Defense that focuses on security and defense issues. They had the scoop here. It was a very informative piece. I encourage you to check it out. In the mainstream media, surprise, surprise, not picking this up, but hey, that's why we do what we do, because if Saudi Arabia is going to buy missile defense systems from Israel, that's kind of a big story, to say the least. Again,
it's a huge story
in the world's most pivotal region, because what happens in the Middle East does not stay in the Middle East. It profoundly affects all of us, no matter where we live.
And that's the whole idea of, 9/11. It affects us here because Osama bin Laden sees what's going on in Israel with the Palestinians, and he says, oh, these Zionists are occupying Palestine, right? And he sees, he believes that Islam is the truth, and that he wants to, make sure. There's a lot of negative stuff written about Jewish people, specifically and Christians in the Quran. But he wants to, free the Palestinian people. Now, just a quick, before I end this whole thing, because I'm basically going to end on this note, but what about the Palestinians, right? Like what's going on with the Palestinians that you would say these people are supported? Like, why are these people supported by a lot of Arab nations, right? Like, are they Arab? And the answer to that is, maybe there was some mixing that went on during the Ottoman Empire, because that's what, before Israel was Israel. For a little while, it was Palestine, but Palestine was created by the same people that most Palestinians would say are colonizers. Like, I don't know, listen to these Palestinian, American people, famous, kind of left-leaning, left-wing, but not, the Hadid family, Bella Hadid, Anwar Hadid, those people, or other celebrity, famous Palestinians, the Qadra family, right? You got Simi Hayes Qadra or Salman Hayek Qadra, who were born in Saudi Arabia, seemingly. What did they think about this whole thing? And seemingly, they're this idea that I can see from the stuff that's shared on social media is, well, these people are colonizers, like the Western powers are colonizers. And it's like, well, those colonizers literally created Palestine the only time it's been Palestine in any time recently. Like, those colonizers literally created the short-lived nation of Palestine, right? But before that, it was just ruled by other, like, Muslim majority entities like the Ottoman Empire. I mean, actually, it hadn't been Palestine or anything like it for a long time. Even if there were autonomous regions within the area that, they considered themselves Palestinian, they were ruled over by other Muslim groups, right? So again, are the Palestinians Arab? They're Middle Eastern for sure, and they're very actually, probably if you did DNA tests, a lot of them I would assume would be very closely related to their Israeli neighbors, right? I mean, a number of them at least. So yeah. So what I was going to get at is, when you really break it down, Palestine, like, okay, so do they claim based on this idea that they were Palestine as a nation for like 20, 30 years or something, right? Since like 1917 to like 48 or whatever, 1919 to 48, whatever. I mean, do they claim, like, from those declarations by the colonizers that they all claim to hate, that are like, thanks for that though, colonizers, I guess. I mean, is that the period of time that they're talking about? Or are they like that they were Palestine? Or is it like a way back more ancient, when it was the Philistines that were being dealt with like biblically, and like, who were one of the groups in the Promised Land that the Hebrews basically displace out of the region. And like, well, when you look at it religious, like based on what the religions say, in Judaism and like Christianity, they were heathen people. Like, they didn't follow Yahweh, the one true God, right? They were like basically people living in the land that they might have had some really messed up practices. Like, some of the people in the land, whether this was the Philistines or not, would like put their babies in furnaces, according, biblically, right? And so like, these people were the ancient Hebrew people were told, like, go out and displace these people. They have these wicked practices. So, they go into the land, and you have the famous story of David and Goliath, right? Goliath is a Philistine. Or, etymologically, I'm 100%, like, high 90s% sure Philistine and Palestinian are basically the same. I think in Arabic, if you're going to say Palestinian, you say like Philistini or something. It's very close, right? So David defeats Goliath, or, the other biblical narrative is David's men defeat Goliath, or his troop defeats Goliath's troop. And, I believe, just like every biblical narrative, there's stuff in the language of like what the name Goliath means, what the name David means. David comes and defeats him in the name of Yahweh, and he does it, and he cuts his head off, and blah, 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 right? That's the story. And then David eventually founds Jerusalem after, he like purchases this area that becomes the city of David, is like Jerusalem and stuff like that. Whether it was already an occupied area, whether he buys it, I think maybe the biblical story is partially he like purchases the land that becomes where the Temple Mount is, and all these things. There might be some occupied area, but it's like, it is what becomes like the capital of the monarchy, essentially, right? And David is this king who is representative of the Messiah that Jewish people are waiting for, at least the Messiah ben David, and the ruling, reigning Messiah versus the Messiah ben Joseph. Christians believe that's both fulfilled in Jesus. Muslims believe this. Muslims believe that Jalut, which is the Arabic word for Goliath, was not a follower of Allah. like him and his people, which would be the Philistines, the Palestinians, they were not Muslims. They were not true believers in God. And that David was, in fact, a true believer in the God that they follow. They say Allah. David clearly says Yahweh. But whoever it is, Goliath and the Philistines, the Palestinians, they don't follow this God. David is given kingship and authority over the land. And like his people are the ones that rule over the land. That's where, that's the children of Israel, right? That's not what the Palestinians get. So, I mean, religiously, other than now a lot of Palestinians are Muslim, like only a small percentage are either Jewish or Christian. Very small percentage. The actual religious stuff would seem to indicate it's pretty much Israel's. Like, I mean, debate me on it. I think you'd lose based on what it says in the Quran. I remember reading this story and I was like, oh, yeah, I guess, it looks like the land probably is Israel's based on what the Quran says. Anyway, that being the narrative, especially when these are more well-known to like Western people, it's hard to support this group of people who are claiming like the Zionists or whatever. It's like, I'm not for a lot of what Israel does, personally. I think they represent in the Middle East Western values, democracy, and Judeo-Christianity, but that represents like, you have the freedom to do what you want and you're not going to be executed for it. Like generally, people might be angry and try to convert you, but like ideally, you're going to be left alone. Whereas on the other side of things, like what's going on in Afghanistan, women, you aren't going to have educated women anymore. And you aren't going to have, these values, which, again, like let me bring up Bella Hadid or Anwar Hadid or Gigi Hadid or the Qadra twins or their brother Fi, any of them, like all the values, like they would be enemies in Afghanistan or in a truly, like especially the way they dress, act, whatever. These famous like Palestinians, right, who are culturally Muslim, but are they really like they could not exist in the way they exist here in America. They couldn't exist in certain Middle Eastern countries that are majority Islamic, and that's just the truth. You definitely wouldn't see them wearing what they wear or the lack of what they wear in those countries. Like in Afghanistan, it's like, put this on or die. It's your choice, but it's not really your choice, and we're going to strip you of all your rights. And yet somehow this is the religion that they choose to support. I don't get it. Then, my guess is they fall back on secularism, which, well, this stuff is still playing out, and like, that's not going to help you. So I'm just saying there's a reasonable thing to support, there's a reasonable ideology to support, but, make your own choice. And that's the whole point. That's what I'm getting at. You can make that choice in like Western Christian, Judeo-Christian countries. You can't make that choice in a number of these majority Muslim countries. Specifically, remember that what it says in... first of all, that women couldn't drive in Saudi Arabia until like, I was in college when they got that right, I'm pretty sure. So it's the past 10 years, they got, I don't know. It hadn't been that long that women have been able to drive alone in Saudi Arabia. And then look at this. There is a surah, which I talk about in my other video, the one about dancing Israelis. There is basically a chapter in the Quran which very clearly says, do not take the Jews and Christians for your allies, protectors, or friends. It's a word that can seemingly be translated into any of those. I even put a link to Islam Awakened where you can see numerous versions of the Quran. It's either translated as friends, allies, or protectors. Let's say it's allies even, but I think it's friends. It looks like friends to me. Don't take them as your friends, but even as allies. What is Saudi Arabia doing here? I mean, what are these nations, the Abrahamic nations, doing? You know, Abrahamic nations. I say that, like, what are the Muslim majority nations doing? They're taking what is the Jewish homeland, essentially, like a Jewish state, and those are their allies, right? That is directly against what it says in the Quran. But again, if it makes more sense and like, oh, well, economically it makes sense, and, you know, it's hard to actually follow the Quran in Western society because, you know, you end up having all sorts of terrible things that the Quran says that you can do or should do, like you have to do. And so, yeah, you know, let's not exactly follow it. Let's skim it and claim whatever, you know. And I actually think that's why Iran looks at them and are like, that's one of the reasons. Anyway, it's also just because they can, as, you know, the other entity. Iran would probably be doing the same thing if they could, but they're the minority, but they still have enough power to be disrupted in the region. Anyway, okay, that's it. Again, religiously, based on Christianity, Judaism, Islam, Palestine is Israel. Israel has a claim on it legitimately, just based on all three of the religions in it. Not just what I said. There's more passages. I'm just giving you the easiest explanatory story that I pulled out of the narratives, right? But, you know, I think it's hard for them to continue to support, especially when the Palestinians will not compromise. Even when it's good for the Palestinians to compromise, their leadership won't compromise. And that's where it ends up being the biggest problem. Like, Israel has laid out some decent, you know, things, like some decent plans, right? I think a number of decent plans have been laid out. I think way in the past, even better plans were laid out that, you know, they just didn't want a Jewish state at all, so they said no to, which probably these days they would have taken that in a heartbeat. So anyway, I mean, you know, don't let the hypocrisy from like westernized Muslims who wouldn't be able to exist in these actual Muslim majority nations like fool you. Like these cultural Muslims, like they just follow kind of tradition, but they don't follow the book, and, you know, they aren't actually in a situation where it's dangerous for them to not follow the book, like whatever. Don't let them kind of fool you as to what the narrative is. In reality, you know, it would appear to be based on, you know, the kingship and authority given to David by Allah, even in the Quran. Like, it would be the children of Israel's, I believe, right? Other than, you know, now Palestinians are more Muslim, and they, like, you know, these other nations would say, oh, okay, well, now that they're Muslim, you know, they deserve the land. It's like, well, that's not what the book says. And doesn't it also just say, like, you know, the Jewish Holy Lands, like, let them have their Holy Lands? So anyway, you know, that's a paraphrase, and, you know, there's, that's a whole different story. But what I told you about David and Goliath, that part's true. David and Jalut, Dawood and Jalut. Anyway, that's it for this episode of FringeCraft. I've been Matt. This is why, you know, we started at the Saudi connection to 9/11 and the cover-up connected to it, and we've ended up in Israel and Palestine. And how does that happen? Well, Osama bin Laden specifically said himself that's why, is that the United States supported Israel. And again, Israel, Judaism, Christianity, United States, Saudi Arabia, Iran, all the other Gulf Arab nations, like all these, you know, it's all intertwined when it comes to this topic. And it's very hard to separate these things. And when you start to separate them, the narrative falls apart as to why things are happening. That's why you get some of these, like, wait, why did we go to Afghanistan? None of the hijackers were from Afghanistan. What is this? Like, what? Why? Like, why does this matter? Like, why did we go to Iraq? Why did, you know? like you realize, oh, it's all intertwined. You can't really, you know, take one part and just that's the narrative. It's like you have to have all of it if you really want a good understanding of what's going on. And this is just like of public things. I'm sure there's plenty known. Like my speculation that Israeli intelligence knew that 9/11 was going to happen based on the, you know, dancing Israelis, and so did the United States intelligence services, and that it was allowed to happen in order to benefit whatever. Not that the whole government allowed it, but that, you know, the groups that did, it wasn't like the higher ups and in the intelligence services, they benefited a lot from it. It wasn't something that, you know, like who's gonna punish them? Like, really, like, how's anybody gonna know who's gonna punish them? All you can do is speculate. And like, again, I'm pretty sure, you know, the Israelis probably had some blackmail on the U.S. intelligence service saying, like, you guys need to let our guys go because we clearly have evidence that you knew this was coming. Why else would that happen like that? I mean, sure, they're allies, but, you know, this was the biggest attack on America ever. It's not like, you know, they're just going to let an ally do that kind of attack unless, they just knew, and these guys were there as part of the, like, you know, intelligence collection stuff, and they weren't the only ones, and, you know, whatever. Anyway, that's why it's all connected. That's why, you know, putting it all together in one narrative kind of helps, and you got to have as many viewpoints to understand that narrative, and you got to have all the different facets, and, you know, we can't know everything as John Q. Public, right? It's like we aren't going to be told everything, so there's some of it we're going to have to speculate on. I hope you've enjoyed this episode of FringeCraft. That's all for today. Please like and subscribe, and, you know, hit the notification bell for more content like this. I'm probably going to do 1 or 2 more videos on 9/11 because of the 20th anniversary this week. Next 2 are like, you know, this one, how much people made, like the budget, you know, basically the money aspect of things, and then the media, like, as far as what did Hollywood guess would be like, what did Hollywood foreshadow, whether anybody knew or not. I think it was less that they knew and more that, like, oh yeah, these are pretty basic concepts. Like, you know, it's not like when the US government says it's failure of imagination, it's like, well, is it really failure of imagination? Hollywood guessed it pretty clearly, like almost the exact thing if you put a couple of these together. And then, you know, more so, we're going to then get into the Patriot Act and the surveillance state and, like, what it's led to domestically and, you know, even foreign affairs as far as surveillance is concerned, because that, you know, where do you think these trillions of dollars went to if not to spy on everyone? Or to go to war with some people, but to spy on everyone. So anyway, all right, that's it. Hope you have a good day. I'm out. Later.